The store was already running by the time he pushed through the glass doors. Carts rolling, registers beeping. The faint smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery section at the far end of the aisle. Everything exactly as it should be, and yet something in the air felt off in a way he couldn't name. Ethan Cole pulled his cap lower and kept walking. No one looked up. No one gave him a second glance. Just another man in a faded hoodie moving through the morning like everyone else. And then he saw her. Checkout lane 3. Young woman. Both hands still working, scanning, bagging, moving, but her shoulders carried something that had nothing to do with the job. Something heavier. Something she was fighting very hard not to let anyone see. He almost kept walking. He didn't. He had driven 3 hours to get here. Not because Hartford was far, he had a regional office 20 minutes from this very parking lot. But Ethan Cole hadn't wanted a company car scheduled visit or anyone straightening their posture the moment word got around that corporate was coming. He'd wanted a Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday, the kind where nobody performed. So he drove himself alone in the kind of truck that wouldn't turn a single head in a strip mall parking lot. He left his phone on the passenger seat with notifications silenced. No assistant, no security detail. Just him and the nagging feeling that had kept him up the past 2 weeks, ever since he'd sat across from his HR director and stared at a slide he couldn't stop thinking about. Turnover rates, spiking across 14 branches over the past 2 quarters. No incidents on record, no exit interview patterns. Just people leaving quietly one after another, without explanation. His HR director had shrugged and called it a labor market issue. Ethan had nodded, closed the meeting, and driven home. But that night, after he'd gotten Liam bathed and put to bed after he'd sat alone at the kitchen table, with the house quiet around him, the way it always got too quiet. After 8 o'clock, he kept coming back to the same question. Not the numbers, the people behind them. Who were they? What had they needed that they hadn't gotten? And why hadn't anyone noticed them leaving until it was already too late? He knew something about going unnoticed, about carrying weight in silence, because you decided somewhere along the way that asking for help would cost more than it was worth. 4 years ago, when his wife passed, Ethan had buried himself in work, the way a man buries anything he doesn't know how to hold. He signed contracts. He expanded into new markets. He told his board the numbers had never looked better. And every night he went home to a 9-year-old boy who drew pictures of his mother and left them on the kitchen counter without saying a word, and Ethan would fold them carefully and put them in the drawer by the sink, and neither of them talked about it. He had learned to read the surface of things, the smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, the voice that stayed steady a beat too long, the small practiced performance of someone who had decided that fine was the only acceptable answer. He recognized it the moment he saw her. Checkout lane 3. She couldn't have been older than her early 30s, dark circles concealed under foundation that had started to fade by mid-morning, hair pulled back in the way of someone who hadn't had time to think about it. Her name tag said, Sarah. Her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times item to scanner beep bag next. The rhythm was perfect, automatic, the kind of muscle memory that kept going even when the rest of you was somewhere else entirely. Her jaw was set, her eyes stayed down. And once, just once, when there was a brief gap between customers, she brought one hand up to her face, in a motion so quick and practiced it would have been invisible to anyone not paying attention. Ethan was paying attention. He moved deeper into the store, pulling a basket from the rack near the entrance, and falling into the unhurried pace of a man with nowhere to be. He picked up a box of crackers he didn't need, studied the label, set it down. He was watching without watching the way he used to do in his early days, when he worked the floor himself and learned everything worth knowing from the people who showed up every single day. The store itself looked right. The floors were clean. Signage was properly placed. Inventory levels looked solid from where he walked. A new hire was restocking the end cap on aisle 7 with the careful slowness of someone still learning the system, and a woman Ethan guessed was a shift lead moved past him with a clipboard murmuring something into a headset. Normal. All of it. Normal. But the employees moved through the morning with a particular kind of quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a team that knew each other well, but the careful quiet of people who had learned not to draw attention. Heads down, tasks completed, conversations kept short. Ethan had built 23 stores from the ground up before he ever hired a team large enough to run things without him. He knew the difference between a floor that was functioning and a floor that was holding its breath. This one was holding its breath. He circled back toward the front, keeping his pace unhurried, and found a spot near the magazine rack with a clean sight line to lane 3. Sarah was already with the next customer. Her hands were still moving, and she still hadn't let herself stop. He spent the next hour pretending to shop. It wasn't difficult. The store was large enough that a man moving slowly through the aisles didn't attract attention, and Ethan had spent enough years reading rooms to know how to disappear inside one. He kept the basket in his hand, added items he didn't need, and drifted past the dairy section, past the deli counter, past the end caps, with their handwritten sale signs, always circling back toward the front, toward lane 3, toward the woman who hadn't stopped working for a single moment since he'd first laid eyes on her. He picked up information the way you pick up anything in a store like this, slowly, without rushing, by simply being present long enough for the world around you to forget you're listening. Near the break room entrance, 2 employees were talking in the low, comfortable shorthand of people who had worked together long enough to stop finishing their sentences. Ethan slowed near a display of canned soup and kept his eyes on the labels. One of them, a young man with a name tag that read, Derek, was saying something about coverage, about how Sarah had come in last Thursday, even though her daughter had a fever, because the neighbor who usually watched the girl had her own kid sick and couldn't take one more, and Sarah hadn't wanted to call out. She never calls out, Derek said. Not with admiration exactly, but with the particular exhaustion of someone who had watched a person push too hard for too long. Not once in 14 months. Not for herself, not for the kid. She just figures it out. The other employee, a woman Ethan didn't catch the name of, made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite sympathy. She gave Marcus her lunch again yesterday. New guy didn't bring anything. She said she wasn't hungry. Neither of them said anything after that. There wasn't much to say. Ethan moved on. He learned the rest in pieces. Sarah always took the early shift, so she could pick up her daughter from school herself. She had worked through last winter's ice storm, when 3 other employees had called out, and she'd covered 2 of their registers back to back without complaint. Her drawer had never once been short. Her customer satisfaction scores, the ones tallied through the company's quarterly feedback system, which Ethan had implemented himself 3 years ago, were consistently in the top tier of the entire Hartford branch. And this morning, sometime before 9, she had received a phone call. That was all anyone knew. She'd stepped to the side, answered it, and come back with her eyes red and her jaw set fixed and deliberate, the expression of someone who had decided that whatever was happening inside her body was not allowed to happen here. Not on this floor, not in front of these people. The wall she'd built around herself was nearly perfect. Nearly. Ethan was standing at the edge of aisle 4 when the man walked in. He was the kind of customer that every retail employee recognized before he reached the counter. The set of the shoulders, the way he scanned the lane selections, with the look of someone already prepared to be dissatisfied. He was middle-aged, well-dressed in the casual way of someone who wanted you to know they didn't need to dress up, and he moved to lane 3 with the certainty of a man who had never once considered that the person on the other side of the register might be having a harder morning than he was. It started with the price on a bag of coffee. He was certain it had been marked lower on the shelf. Sarah calmly offered to call someone to check. He told her not to bother, that it was always like this, that nobody here ever knew what they were doing. His voice didn't rise. It stayed in that register that was somehow worse than shouting, flat and deliberate and designed to make the other person feel small. Sarah's expression didn't change. She kept her hands moving. When he pushed his cart forward and the edge of it knocked a bagged item off the belt, she reached down and picked it up without a word. At the end of the transaction, he didn't hand her the bills. He set them on the counter on the far edge, just far enough that she had to reach and turned away before she'd finished counting the change. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir," Sarah said to his back. "Have a good day." He didn't respond. Ethan waited until the man had moved toward the exit before he stepped forward. He didn't have anything in his basket that needed checking out at this lane. He set it down on the edge of the belt, anyway, the way a person does when they've committed to something and are no longer interested in backing out. Sarah looked up with the automatic brightness of someone whose face had been trained to reset between customers. The smile was practiced and immediate. It almost worked. "Did you find everything okay?" she asked. "I did," Ethan said. Then after a moment, "Are you okay?" The question landed differently than she expected. He could see it in the way her hands slowed just slightly before catching themselves again. She'd been asked that question before, from coworkers, from habit, from the harmless small talk of a long shift. But something about the way he'd said it, quiet and direct, without the vague social momentum that usually carried those three words, made it harder to deflect on autopilot. She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. "I'm fine," she said. "Just a long morning." Her voice cracked on the last word. Not much, barely enough to notice. Ethan noticed. He didn't push. He took his basket and moved aside, and he didn't look back at her directly. But he stayed near the front of the store, and he watched, and he thought about the way her voice had broken on morning, like something in her had been pulled one thread too tight. 20 minutes later, he found the shift lead. Her name was Carol, a woman in her late 40s, with the calm, measured manner of someone who had seen most things and stopped being surprised by them. She was checking inventory near the back coolers when Ethan approached, and he kept his questions casual, indirect, the way he'd learned to do in the early years when he was gathering information and didn't want people to know it. He mentioned the checkout lanes, said he'd noticed the woman at lane 3 seemed to be handling a lot on her own, asked if the staffing was usually stretched that thin on Tuesdays. Carol glanced toward the front of the store before she answered. "Sarah's one of the best we have," she said, and the way she said it carried something that wasn't quite worry and wasn't quite helplessness, but lived somewhere between the two. "She's been here over a year, never a problem. But this morning," she stopped, looked at the shelf in front of her. "She got a call before her shift started. I don't know the details, but I know she's been dealing with something with her daughter for a while now. Medical stuff." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "That sounds serious." Carol set a carton down on the shelf with more care than it needed. "Her little girl needs surgery. Something with her ear, she was born with it apparently. Sarah's been trying to get it covered for months." She shook her head slowly. "I don't know what the call was about this morning, but after she hung up, she looked like, I don't know, like someone had just told her the last door closed." Ethan thanked her and walked away. He stood in the cereal aisle for a long time after that, not looking at anything, just standing there while the store moved around him, carts and beeps and the distant sound of someone's child laughing near the bakery, while he turned what Carol had told him over and over in his mind. A 5-year-old girl, a surgery that should have been routine, a mother who hadn't missed a single day of work in 14 months and was still standing at her register with her jaw set and her hands moving because she had no other choice. He thought about Liam, about the year after his wife died, when his son had gone quiet in that particular way. That wasn't peace but grief, and Ethan had taken him to 3 different specialists and never once looked at the bill because he didn't have to, because he could make that call and have it handled before lunch. Sarah couldn't make that call. He was still thinking about it when he heard the announcement over the store's intercom, a flat professional voice asking Sarah Mitchell to please come to the branch manager's office. Something in the phrasing of it was wrong. Too formal for a routine check-in. Too deliberate. Ethan moved toward the front. He positioned himself near the service desk, close enough to see the hallway that led to the back offices, far enough not to be obvious. He watched Sarah come out from behind her register, smooth the front of her uniform once with both hands, and walk toward the office with her chin level and her back straight. He waited. 14 minutes later, she came back out. She was holding a piece of paper, not tightly, just carrying it the way you carry something you haven't fully processed, yet something your hands accepted before your brain caught up. She walked to the small bench along the hallway wall and sat down, looked at the paper in her hands. Ethan didn't need to read it to know what it was. He'd seen enough performance reviews, enough HR documentation, enough formal warnings in his career to recognize the shape of one from 30 feet away. The man from lane 3, the one who'd set his bills on the far edge of the counter and turned away before she'd finished, had filed a complaint. And based on the way the branch manager's door had already closed again behind her, the conversation had been swift, official, and final. Sarah stared at the paper for a long moment. Then her face did something that it hadn't done all morning through the phone call and the rude customer and the hours of standing and smiling and holding herself together with what had to be nothing but sheer practiced will. It broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just the way a thing breaks when it's been under pressure for too long and finally runs out of room to hold. Her chin dipped, and the tears came quietly, the way they do when a person has cried enough times in hard places that even their grief has learned to be discreet. Ethan stood at the far end of the hallway and watched a woman who had done everything right have everything go wrong. And he felt something shift in him that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or operational reviews or the reason he'd driven 3 hours to be here. He'd come to this store looking for a problem he could fix from a distance. What he found was standing 20 feet away, holding a warning letter she didn't deserve, crying in a hallway where she thought no one was watching. He was watching, and he was done standing still. He walked to the office door and knocked once. Not the way a customer knocks. Not tentative, not polite. The knock of someone who has already decided what happens next and is simply observing the formality of announcing it. A voice from inside said, "Come in." The branch manager was a man named Greg Holloway, mid-50s, the kind of build that suggested he'd been athletic once and had since made peace with the distance between then and now. He was sitting behind his desk when Ethan entered, and he looked up with the mild irritation of a man who expected to see a lost customer and was prepared to redirect them efficiently. "Can I help you?" Greg asked. Ethan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He reached up and took off his cap. He set it on the edge of the desk. Greg's expression shifted in stages. First, the small confusion of a man trying to place a face he half recognized, then the slow recalibration as the name, the face, the posture, the stillness all assembled themselves into something his brain refused to accept for a full 3 seconds. "My name is Ethan Cole," Ethan said. "I own this store." The room was very quiet after that. Greg stood up. Whether it was instinct or panic, his body had decided that sitting was no longer appropriate. "Mr. Cole, I wasn't aware you were. Nobody told me you were." "No," Ethan said. "They weren't supposed to." He didn't sit down. He didn't pace. He stood in the center of the office with his hands at his sides and looked at Greg Holloway with the particular calm of a man who had spent 20 years making decisions that other people spent weeks agonizing over, and had learned that the moment you raised your voice, you gave something away. "Tell me about the warning you just issued to Sarah Mitchell," he said. Greg's face moved through several expressions before landing on one he seemed to consider defensible. We received a formal complaint from a customer this morning. Under company policy, any documented customer complaint requires a written response and— I was in the store, Ethan said. I watched the entire interaction. Greg stopped. The customer placed his money on the far edge of the counter and walked away before she'd finished the transaction. Ethan continued. Sarah thanked him and wished him a good day. That was the extent of her conduct. He let that sit for a moment. Walk me through how that becomes a formal warning. The explanation Greg offered was exactly what Ethan expected. Policy language procedural framing, the careful architecture of someone building a structure they hoped would hold weight. The customer had complained about her attitude. There had been a prior note in her file about a difficult interaction months ago that Greg referenced now with the confidence of a man who believed paperwork made him right. Ethan listened to all of it. He understood as Greg was talking what had actually happened here. Greg was a man who had run this branch for 3 years with minimal oversight from above. He had built his own small order, his regulars, his routines, his unspoken arrangements, and it had never occurred to him that anyone would look closely enough to see the difference between managing a store and managing it for himself. He hadn't issued that warning out of malice exactly. He'd issued it because he could, and because the person on the receiving end didn't have the standing to push back. That was the part that stayed with Ethan longest. How long have you known the customer who filed the complaint? Ethan asked. The silence that followed told him everything Carol hadn't. Greg's jaw tightened. He's a regular. I know a lot of our regulars. That's not what I asked. Another silence, shorter this time, because Greg was smart enough to understand that the longer it stretched, the worse it looked. We've known each other for a few years, outside of work. That has nothing to do with— It has everything to do with it, Ethan said. You issued a formal disciplinary warning to your highest-rated cashier on the basis of a complaint filed by a personal friend for an interaction that by any objective standard she handled with more professionalism than he deserved. He reached across the desk and picked up the warning letter, the copy Greg had kept for his own files, and looked at it once before setting it back down. That warning is rescinded, as of right now. Greg's face had gone the color of old concrete. Mr. Cole, with respect, the proper channel for a decision like that would be to go through HR, and I built the HR department, Ethan said. I'll handle it. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls standing right there in the office. The first was to his head of people operations, a woman named Dr. Patricia Webb, who picked up on the second ring and said nothing. When Ethan explained what he needed, just asked for the employee ID and the branch code, and told him she would have everything updated in the system within the hour. The second call was to the benefits team. He asked them to pull Sarah Mitchell's full insurance file and flag it for immediate review. He told them he wanted a human being, not an automated response, not a generated letter, to personally review the denied claim for her daughter's procedure and call him directly with their findings by end of day. When the benefits coordinator on the other end started to explain the standard review timeline, Ethan said, I understand the timeline. I'm asking you to work outside of it. And the conversation ended shortly after that. He put his phone in his pocket and looked at Greg Holloway one last time. I'm going to need your keys and your badge, Ethan said. You're done here. Greg opened his mouth, closed it. His hands moved to the desk as if looking for something to hold on to. You can't just— You used your position to protect someone who mistreated your best employee and to punish her for it, Ethan said. That's not a policy question. That's a character question. And I've had my answer. Greg left the keys on the desk. He didn't say anything else. The door closed behind him with a sound that was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Ethan stood alone in the office for a moment. He looked at the framed quarterly performance chart on the wall. Numbers. He recognized targets. He'd set metrics that had looked clean and strong in the boardroom presentation last month. He thought about how much you could make something look like it was working while the people inside it were quietly falling apart. He thought about 14 months, about a woman who had never called out sick, who gave her lunch to a new hire, who thanked a man for being rude to her and meant none of it, and did it anyway, because she needed this job more than she needed her dignity intact. He walked back out to the floor. The store had continued moving while the world behind the office door had shifted. Carts still rolled. The intercom murmured a price check. Near the front, Derek was opening a new register lane with the bored efficiency of someone who didn't know yet that anything had changed. Sarah was still on the bench. She'd stopped letting it show. She was sitting with her back straight again, the warning letter folded once in her hands, staring at the middle distance with the expression of someone running numbers in their head and not liking what they added up to. Ethan sat down on the bench beside her. She looked up sharply the way anyone does when a stranger enters their peripheral space without warning. Then she recognized him, the man from Lane 3, the one who had asked if she was okay, and her expression settled into something carefully neutral. "I owe you an explanation," Ethan said. He told her without preamble. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. He told her who he was. He told her he'd been in the store since 9 that morning. He told her the warning had been rescinded and that Greg Holloway would not be back on this floor. Sarah listened without moving. Her hand stayed still in her lap, the folded letter between them. When he finished, she didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't say anything for a moment, and he didn't fill the space. Then she said quietly, "The warning was the least of it." "I know," he said. "Tell me about your daughter." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she'd done briefly at the register, the assessment of someone deciding whether trust was a risk worth taking. Whatever she found in his face must have been enough, because she exhaled slowly and told him. Her daughter's name was Lily. She was 5 years old and had been born with a condition affecting her left ear, a small structural abnormality that the doctors said was entirely correctable with surgery. Nothing complicated the kind of procedure that took less than 2 hours and had a recovery time of a few weeks. The kind of thing that if you had good insurance and a little luck, got scheduled and handled, and became nothing more than a story you told later. Sarah had the insurance. She'd enrolled in the company plan specifically because it covered pediatric surgical procedures. She'd been told more than once by more than one person at the insurance company that Lily's case qualified. The call this morning had been a final denial notice. The insurer had reclassified the procedure as elective, not medically necessary, not covered. $14,000. That was the out-of-pocket estimate the hospital had given her. $14,000 and 6 days left to file an appeal before the window closed permanently. She said all of this in the flat, factual tone of someone who had already done their crying about it and was now simply reporting the situation. But her hand, still holding the folded warning letter, pressed together, just slightly harder, when she said Lily's name. "The appeal," Ethan said. "Have you filed it yet?" "I have the paperwork," Sarah said. I needed to get through today first." He nodded. "I called our benefits team while I was in the office. I've asked them to personally review your file and call me directly. If the appeal goes through, it goes through. If it doesn't," he stopped, chose the next words carefully. "If it doesn't, I'll cover the cost myself. All of it." Sarah turned and looked at him with an expression he recognized. He'd worn it himself once, the face of someone receiving help so far outside what they'd allowed themselves to expect that the first response wasn't gratitude, but disorientation. The sense that the ground had shifted, and you weren't sure yet if you trusted the new surface under your feet. "You don't know me," she said. "I know 14 months of perfect attendance," he said. "I know you gave your lunch to a new hire. I know you thanked a man who was rude to you because you couldn't afford to do anything else." He looked at her steadily. "I know enough." She looked down at the letter in her hands. Then she set it on the bench beside her, just set it there, not crumpling it, not throwing it, just releasing it, and covered her face with both hands for a moment, breathing. When she looked up again, her eyes were wet, but her voice was level. "Lily's going to ask me how this happened," she said, "and I'm not going to know what to tell her." "Tell her someone was paying attention," Ethan said. "That's all." He stood up. He had more to do. Carol needed to be briefed. The shift needed a manager, and he had calls waiting that he'd been ignoring for the better part of 6 hours. But before he left the bench, he said one more thing. "I'm going to ask everyone to gather for a few minutes before the next shift change. I have something I want to say to this team. You don't have to be there, but I'd like it if you were." Sarah looked up at him. "What are you going to say?" "The truth," he said. "I should have said it a long time ago." He gathered the store's employees in the open space near the front, a loose, uncertain group of 15 people who had spent the last 20 minutes fielding fragments of rumor and were now standing in front of a man in a faded hoodie who was apparently their owner. Some of them recognized him now. Some of them were still working it out. Ethan didn't use a podium or a microphone. He stood in front of them the way he used to stand in front of 4 employees in a store the size of a large living room when everything he owned was in it, and failure was not a concept, but a physical possibility he could see from where he stood. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said. "I started this company with 1 store, 12 employees, and a lease I wasn't sure I could make the second payment on. I worked the floor myself for 3 years before I could afford to hire a manager." He looked at the faces in front of him, some guarded, some cautious, 1 or 2, with the careful blankness of people who had learned that listening without reacting was safer than the alternative. "I know what it costs to show up every day when showing up is the hardest thing you're doing," he said. "I know what it is to hold something together with nothing left to hold it with because there is no other option. I know because I've done it. And I'm standing here today because I stopped paying attention to whether the people working for me were doing the same thing, and I should have been." He announced 2 changes that would take effect across all company branches within 30 days. The first was an emergency assistance fund, a direct resource for any employee facing a medical or financial crisis, with applications reviewed by a team that reported to him personally. The second was an anonymous reporting line separate from standard HR channels for any employee who needed to raise a concern about management conduct without fear of consequence. He thanked them and told them to get back to their day. As the group dispersed, he found Sarah's face in the crowd. She was standing near the back, arms folded not defensively the way a person folds their arms when they're closed off, but the way they do when they're holding themselves steady. She wasn't crying. She was watching him with the full, clear attention of someone who had spent all morning being invisible and was still adjusting to the feeling of being seen. She gave him a single nod, small, deliberate, the kind that carries more weight than words. He returned it. Then she walked back toward Lane. 3 took her position behind the register and began the next transaction with both hands, steady and her chin level. 3 weeks later, Ethan drove to Hartford General and parked in the same lot he'd used when he came for an entirely different reason. The waiting room on the 3rd floor was nothing like a boardroom, plastic chairs and 2 shades of beige, a television mounted too high on the wall, a vending machine humming in the corner. Ethan had been in rooms like this before, back when the world was smaller and the stakes wore a different shape. He knew how to sit in them, how to let time move at the pace it insisted on. Liam sat beside him with a spiral notebook open on his lap. He was 9 years old and had decided sometime in the past few years that drawing was how he processed things he didn't fully understand yet, which meant he drew constantly. He'd brought colored pencils. He was working on something with careful concentration. His tongue pressed lightly to his upper lip, the way it always did when he was focused. "What are you making?" Ethan asked. Liam held up the notebook. It was a picture of a rabbit wearing a doctor's coat, standing next to a smaller rabbit with a bandage over one ear. Both of them were smiling. At the bottom, in handwriting that was still working out its relationship with the lines he'd written, "Feel better, Lily." Ethan looked at it for a moment. "She's going to like that," he said. Liam went back to adding details to the rabbit's coat. Ethan leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. The surgery had begun at 8:15 that morning. 2 hours the doctors had estimated. Routine. Nothing complicated. The kind of thing that, if you had good insurance and a little luck, got handled and became nothing more than a story you told later. Sarah had gotten both. When the surgeon came out just after 10:30 and said everything had gone exactly as planned, Ethan watched Sarah press both hands flat against her face and stand very still for a long moment, the inverse of composure, the body's way of absorbing something good when it has been braced for so long against the alternative. He drove home that night with Liam asleep in the back seat, the notebook still open on the boy's lap, the drawing face up in the dark. He didn't need to see it to remember what it looked like.